Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the LungLife AI Inc. Annual Results Investor Presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab that's just situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please simply type in your questions at any time and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. These will be available via your Investor Meet company dashboard, and we'll notify you by email when these are ready for your review. Before we begin, I would like to submit the following poll, and if you'd give that your kind attention, I'm sure the company will be most grateful. And I'd now like to hand you over to CEO Paul Pagano and CFO David Anderson. Good afternoon to you both.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm happy to be here virtually with all of you, and thank you for your interest in LungLife. For those of you that have heard the story before, this will be a great refresher with some updates. For those of you who are unfamiliar with LungLife, we are a diagnostics company focused on the early detection of lung cancer, all from a simple blood draw. My name is Paul Pagano. I'm the CEO and Chief Scientific Officer of the company. I've been in the healthcare diagnostics space for the better part of 20 years. My focus has been on lung cancer for the past 12. In the last 6, I've been here at LungLife translating novel research and development projects into clinical diagnostic solutions that we offer in our CLIA lab. David, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and then I'll go through the rest of the board.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. So David Anderson, I spent most of my life with BDO, audit and accounting firm in London, as an audit partner for 11 years and leader of one of the audit groups there, then a couple of years as an audit partner with Crowe, and then the last 10 years on the commercial side of life and been with the company since the beginning of 2020. Thanks, Paul. Back to you.
Thank you. So the rest of our board represents a good mix of healthcare and medtech experience, overall excellent operational expertise on which to draw from. Roy Davis, you may be familiar with his name. He was formerly at Gyrus and Optus, now at Medica, as well as a handful of other companies. He spent the last 30 years in the medtech space, and he brings extensive experience as chairman of our board. Andy Bottler is our senior independent NED. He's currently at Riverford Organic Farmers and Octopus VCT, formerly Gooch & Housego, has a lot of experience in mergers and acquisitions and deal making, and so we're delighted to have him as well. James McCullough and Sarah Barrington each have over 20 years of experience in the diagnostic space, and we have the benefit from learning from them directly through their experiences at Exosome Diagnostics, now at Renalytix and Verici. Our scientific advisory board represents the early decision makers in early stage lung cancer. That's your pulmonologists and your radiologists. Just a few names that I'll touch on here. First is Dr. Stephen Dubinet. He's the chief of pulmonary medicine at UCLA and a leading voice in early lung cancer research. Dr. Claudia Henschke is at Mount Sinai Hospital. She is a pioneer in early lung cancer detection. In fact, she pioneered the use of CT screening for early detection well over a decade before it became mainstream. And the last name I'll touch on is Dr. Drew Maganaki. He's our newest addition to the Scientific Advisory Board. He's an expert in treatments for early stage lung cancer and a driving force behind multiple national lung cancer screening efforts, including at the Veterans Administration Hospital System. So why lung cancer? It's the #1 cancer killer. It kills more than the next 3 most common cancers combined. And the reason is that 80% of all lung cancers are diagnosed in later stage, where treatment options are somewhat limited. As with other cancers, if you can detect lung cancer early enough, you can effectively cure the individual. Now, the indeterminate nodule in the CT scan is where a lot of early detection takes place, and there are some issues with that pathway that I'll go into. But how we address it is with our LungLB test. It's been developed over the past decade with multiple peer-reviewed publications, and it all starts off with a simple blood draw that involves 2 very familiar technologies that fit within the current clinical care pathway, and I'll touch on that in a minute. Most importantly, it demonstrates industry-leading performance, and then we magnify that performance through the use of artificial intelligence. Now, since admitting our shares to AIM in July of 2021, we've been on track hitting our key objectives. We continue to enroll patients for our pivotal validation study, which will be critical for commercializing the LungLB test in 2023. So why is it that only 20% of lung cancers are detected early? That's because the current gold standard for early detection is really bronze at best. Doctors do not trust it, and they're mostly confused by what comes out of it. It's all centered around the CT scanner, which is very sensitive at picking up lung nodules, but physicians aren't sure what they are, and that's why they're called indeterminate. It could be a viral infection, a fungal infection, scar tissue, or it could be lung cancer. And the tools at the physician's disposal right now are inadequate. There's the wait and see pathway. That's where the patient will come back in 3 or 6 months to have another CT scan, see if that nodule has grown in size. And during that time, if it does happen to be cancer, that tumor is allowed to grow unchecked. That provides a lot of anxiety for the patient. The other option is to get a biopsy, and this pathway does provide the answer usually a bit more quickly, but it's associated with significant harms and costs. It involves sticking a long needle across the chest wall to grab a little piece of that nodule to look at it under the microscope. Turns out 1 in 20 biopsies results in an adverse event. This is collapsed lung, bleeding, even death. And then when you learn that 40% of all biopsies return a no lung cancer diagnosis, that means we're putting a lot of people in harm's way for no good reason. In addition to those harms, there are escalating costs as you move through this pathway. A CT scan comes at around $200 a test. The second that individual goes off to get a biopsy, the costs then jump to around $15,000. And should that biopsy result in an adverse event that requires hospitalization, the costs then soar to around $38,000. So what you end up with is a standard of care that provides more uncertainty, harms, and healthcare costs than it does answers. Now, in addition to the indeterminate nodule setting, we believe there's another healthcare concern that's addressed by our technology, and that's in post-surgical lung cancer monitoring. With most cancers, if you detect it early, the best therapy is curative intense surgery, and the same is for lung cancer. However, with lung cancer, about 50% of patients who receive that intent to cure surgery will come back to the clinic within 2 years, having that lung cancer returned. And it most commonly presents itself as metastatic disease. That's because circulating tumor cells spread very early on as lung cancer develops, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Standard of care here is to get a CT scan every 6 months for 2 years, but we know the problems around CT scanners. Now that new nodule that pops up, we're not sure if it's scar tissue from the surgery or if it's the lung cancer that's come back. In addition, biopsy is also standard of care, and we know the issues with biopsy. It becomes even less practical after you've had part of your lung removed. So there's a desperate need in the post-surgical monitoring space as well, and we believe that one test, LUNG-LB, can address these 2 unmet needs. So as I alluded to, our market can be divided into a couple different segments: indeterminate nodules or post-surgical monitoring. Indeterminate nodules can be further broken down into those detected in a proper lung cancer screening program versus those that are detected incidentally. The important takeaway here is that as more lung cancers are found in our nodule program, the numbers in the post-surgical monitoring category are going to increase, because right now that number only reflects the 20% of patients that are currently detected early. Any numbers in this market are likely going to be amplified in light of lung cancer screening guidelines that were just updated in 2021. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force made the recommendation to expand the eligibility criteria for people to get a CT scan for early detection. And what that has done is essentially doubled the size of the lung cancer screening market. Additionally, there's an impact from the COVID virus, because it turns out that this virus causes lung nodules that look an awful lot like lung cancer. We understand how many people have been infected. Therefore, when physicians look at CT scans and they find a nodule, it's going to be that much more challenging to interpret. So back to the LUNG-LB test. We mentioned it all starts off with a simple blood draw, and what we're looking for is circulating tumor cells. These are bits of the tumor that enter the bloodstream and try to spread to different parts of the body, a process known as metastasis. And the way we detect them is critical. That's through a process called FISH. That's where we apply our proprietary and patented light signals to DNA and pick them up under the microscope. Lends itself really well to artificial intelligence, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But the important takeaway here is that CTCs in fish are familiar technologies that physicians use commonly in practice. Now, because it's a direct measurement of cancer in the blood, again, we're looking at circulating tumor cells, we have high sensitivity and specificity. It's a well-balanced test. And that's important when it comes time for the physicians to make decisions. There's also good news about the clinical care pathway. If a pulmonologist wants to do a biopsy, there are a series of blood tests that have to be done in advance. What this means is that the lung LB test fits within that care pathway with very little change. It's just an extra tube of blood. Now, previously, we mentioned the harms and the costs associated with this pathway, so the benefits to the patient are crystal clear. Let's reduce the number of unnecessary and risky biopsies and minimize delays in treatment in that wait and see pathway. But this also has to translate to reduced costs. And when biopsy on average costs around $15,000, we know that the lung LB will be priced well below that. And then, of course, there's the extended utility we mentioned in the post-surgical lung cancer monitoring category. Now, circulating tumor cells, I mentioned that's a direct measurement of the cancer. There are complexities in how they are isolated and detected. That's partly represented in all of our IP filings. That's also represented in our proprietary know-how that doesn't leave these four walls. And I tell you this because it gives us a high degree of confidence that this is not going to be easily reproduced elsewhere. But from the physician's perspective, importantly, it's incredibly simple. They draw the blood, they stick it in a prepaid mailer without any ice packs. It could be shipped at ambient temperature. And then they get the clinical report back as either positive or negative. There's nothing challenging to interpret. All the complexity happens in the background, but that's okay. We have the expertise. So first, we isolate the circulating tumor cells, and we do so by removing the cells we're not interested in looking at. So that's your red blood cells and white blood cells. We put them on a microscope slide, and that's where we apply our patented and proprietary fish light signals. Those can be picked up on a microscope system, which takes 3D pictures of the cells, and then automatically categorizes the cells as either normal or abnormal. Then a lab technician comes in, will count the number of CTCs. But again, from the physician's perspective, incredibly simple, positive or negative, no challenges in interpretation. I mentioned before this lends itself really well to artificial intelligence, and I'll set up what I mean by that. So here we have a couple of cells that we identify under the microscope. On the left-hand panel is a normal cell. This has 2 light signals in each channel that we're looking at. So 2 in green, 2 red, 2 aqua, and 2 gold. On the right is how we define a circulating tumor cell. This has 2 in green and red, but it has extra light signals in the aqua and the gold channel that's shown by the arrows. However, the microscope images aren't always this clear, and that's highlighted on the next slide. Here we have an example where one probe is very clear and crisp. The other probe is stretched out like a piece of spaghetti in 3-dimensional space. And the computer ends up misclassifying this because it can't read 3-dimensional images. It actually only reads 2D images. And when you compress things into 2 dimensions, you lose information. So we've been developing an AI algorithm that can more accurately classify these signals by looking at the 3D picture. And we're already seeing the benefits early on in our studies. First is we're seeing a 4 percentage point improvement in sensitivity. To put that in perspective, for every 100 patients who has cancer that takes our test, we will be able to find an additional 4 on top of what the CTC biomarker already found, just by analyzing existing data more effectively. There's also a benefit in terms of enhanced specificity. This comes in a reduction in the number of misclassified CTCs. This translates into reduced operator time looking at the incorrect cells, which means lower labor costs, better margins for our technology. There's also the extra benefit in the AI algorithm providing an objective measure of what a probe is. This is going to be important when regulators come in, want to understand how the AI algorithm impacts the test. We'll be able to open up the hood and say, it qualifies as this level of brightness, this size, this contrast. They'll know exactly what a true probe signal parameter is. So we mentioned before, this is a high-performing test, and what does that look like? So we wrapped up a pilot study in 2021 This was prospective. Enrollees had an indeterminate lung nodule that was going to be biopsied out of 149 subjects from both MD Anderson Cancer Center, Mount Sinai, as well as institutions in the Midwest. And the performance is as follows: 76% sensitivity. That's our ability to classify individuals that do have cancer correctly. 71% specificity, our ability to classify those without cancer correctly. And critically, a positive predictive value of 89%. And let me put that into perspective. Sensitivity and specificity are great to show you how your test performs, but it's a measurement of the past. How well did it perform in a study? But in the clinic, it's all about the future, because in real life, you have an unknown nodule, and the physician needs to make a prediction as to whether or not it's cancer. And so at 89% PPV, that gives the physician confidence to take action. Now, based on the encouraging results from our pilot study, we've been designing a pivotal validation study. And we want to share with you a few reasons why we believe the results from our pilot study will be recapitulated in the validation. First is we've always used the intent to use population. These are individuals with lung nodules that are going to get a biopsy, not healthy versus cancer. The latter is always going to show you better performance, and then you will always be disappointed in your validation study. Cannot tell you how many times I've seen this in the past decade. The second point is that we've taken a multi-center approach from our pilot study. This gives us an understanding about test performance from different centers that might have changes in demographics, different expertise from study PIs, even something as simple as weather and temperature impacts on the blood sample. We understand how the weather from hot and humid temperatures in Houston, Texas during the summer versus freezing cold temperatures from New York during the winter impact our blood sample. Great news, there is no impact. Lastly is the performance is based on the biomarker alone. This does not include the increase from artificial intelligence or clinical factors. What I mean by that is some of our competitors use what are called nodule classifiers. This is where they incorporate clinical factors such as smoking history, nodule size, in addition to their biomarker. These things in and of themselves can predict cancer and will increase your test performance. And it's not to say that LungLife won't be doing that, we will. But what this data shows me is that our biomarker stands strong on its own. So we've been working on two studies. The first is in indeterminate lung nodules. You may have seen the recent announcement of our first participant enrolled in the VA healthcare system. We're very happy to have veterans participating in this. They served our country so proudly, and they continue to serve by volunteering in this very important study. It's a relatively short duration because it's a point-in-time comparison. We compare the blood to the biopsy result. And so we believe that we can have enrollment wrapped up by the first quarter of 2023. Now, the second study that we have initiated is in the post-surgical lung cancer monitoring category. This is going to be a longer study because after enrollment and they've received their intent to cure surgery, we'll need to follow those patients for 2 years to determine when their lung cancer returns. Now, I will say we did decide to put a temporary hold on that. We found that some study sites were a little bit confused and distracted by running both, and the nodule studies really are critical path. We have to preserve that. We're also considering whether or not there's a smarter way to bring this technology to market for the surgical monitoring section. Perhaps it's the LDT route rather than FDA. In the end, it's really the same test. We're answering the same question: is this cancer or is it scar tissue? So we may not have to run an entirely separate FDA study on it. We do understand physicians can use technologies off-label. We'll still have publications to support it. The other benefit, of course, of taking a closer look, particularly when market and economic conditions are in the state they are, this extends our runway. So we've done the analysis to see what we can pause without affecting our critical path. This could potentially extend us deeper into 2024. All right, so on the pivotal validation study, we've designed it in a way to submit the data to the FDA, and we plan on offering it as a service in our CLIA lab. Now, CLIA is the foundation for commercialization. Very pleased to say that we have CLIA in California that covers us for most states. There are a few that have their own process, including New York, and we submitted the application in 2021. We'll be looking to complete our audit in early June of this year. that will allow us into a big market in the New York area. Also, announcement that we had late last year was that our lab received CAP accreditation. That's the College of American Pathologists. We were very proud of the team. This really feeds into our strategic initiative to have a first-in-class quality system. Now, the FDA path is strictly voluntary because we could stick with CLIA alone and commercialize, but we feel that the scientific rigor that's required to undergo a FDA validation study is going to provide confidence to all stakeholders, your payers, your physicians, and the patients alike. Now, we're going to be approaching the FDA with what are called adjunct claims. This is essentially another tool in the physician's toolkit. FDA is very comfortable with adjunct claims because it puts the control back into the doctor's hands. FDA also has something called a Breakthrough Device Designation Program. What this does is it affords an accelerated review path for manufacturers like LungLife. We believe the LungLB test may be eligible. We have the application in hand. We're just waiting for our window to submit. Now, it's great if you can run your test. Fantastic if it passes through all these regulatory hurdles. But if you can't get paid for it, it's an R&D project, and it's really not a clinical diagnostic. And reimbursement is how you're paid here in the United States. It is a lengthy process involving code, price, and coverage, which is why we kicked that process off early. You may have seen that we were granted a PLA code from the American Medical Association earlier this year. That's going to allow providers to more specifically bill for our tests. It's also going to allow us to remain on track for subsequent pricing and coverage processes. So we anticipate that the code will become effective April 1st, and then the pricing meeting will occur in July of this year. That's where they'll decide whether or not LungLife is a candidate for crosswalk or gap fill. Crosswalk is where there's an existing code on the lab fee schedule that LungLife is similar enough to, and we can get the same price. That would put us on the fee schedule in January 1 of 2023. If you recall from last time, we're more than likely going to go down the gap fill route. It's a little bit longer of a process, but the good news is that Medicare works hand in hand with you to understand your costs, what your competitor pricing is, and how you should be priced in terms of value-based pricing in comparison to biopsy. It is a longer process. This will put us on the fee schedule in January 2024. Now, instrumental to this pathway is key alliances with leading healthcare institutions like the one we have with Mount Sinai. They were instrumental and highly active on our pilot study, and as we anticipated, they continue to be a lead enrolling site in our pivotal validation study. I also mentioned the work of Dr. Claudia Henschke early in their presentation, and her work at Mount Sinai at the leading edge of early lung cancer detection. Mount Sinai has been doubling down on our efforts, and they've been recruiting world-renowned experts in early lung cancer research and liquid biopsy. It really shows their commitment to this area. And very pleased that Mount Sinai had invested in us at IPO because they're really showing to be a true partner with us. They see our relationship as a very unique opportunity to take an outside developed technology and couple it with their internal experts in order to create a world-class offering. And the idea here is to build a family of products that complement the LungLB test and really transform patient care in the early detection setting. Now, since admission to AIM just 8 months ago, we've been highly focused on laying the groundwork for key parts of our commercialization path, including hitting important objectives for regulatory and reimbursement. Last time we met, we had engaged our CRO for the nodule study. And then since that last visit, we've been enrolling our first patients. We now have 3 sites activated and enrolling: Mount Sinai, MD Anderson, as well as the Bay Pines VA in Florida. At that time we last met, we had completed our audit for the College of American Pathologists. And as we mentioned, we received that accreditation later that year. Again, absolutely pleased to have that, as it's a nod to our high standards for clinical testing quality. We were preparing the final touches for our PLA code application in October. And then again, we had that granted January 1st of this year from the American Medical Association. Investors should be looking for that to become activated April 1st of this year. And then we've also been building the team out with experienced hands in diagnostic development and regulatory support, including key hires for clinical trials, research and development, project management. as well as quality. In fact, our quality director hire has direct audit experience with the FDA. His claim to fame is having his name on an FDA-approved device. So really delighted to have an experienced and steady pair of hands leading that effort. It really shows our continued investment in supporting our strategic initiative to have a top-notch quality system. And lastly, we've begun to lay the groundwork to make ourselves known through an educational program campaign. Our minicast videos, these are being viewed by healthcare providers across the United States. It's introducing them to who LUNGLIFE is, what our technology is, and we feel that's going to be important come time for commercialization. So what are some things that investors can look forward to in the coming months? So we're going to be continuing to enroll participants for our nodule study. Again, point-in-time comparison, we're on track for completing study enrollment in Q1 of 2023, and then we'd be looking to submit those results to the FDA shortly thereafter. Just a reminder, FDA is completely voluntary. Our plan is to begin offering the test commercially as an LDT in our CLIA lab during our utility studies, just after submission, but prior to receiving FDA authorization. Those utility studies are going to support Medicare coverage or part of that reimbursement pathway for our test and support the LCD approval process. That's going to take time. Continuing on with reimbursement, investors should be expecting towards the end of this year a pricing determination for our best path. That's either crosswalk or gap fill. We'll shoot for crosswalk, but again, it's more likely that we're going to get gap fill. That's what we've been preparing for. So on the clinical lab fee schedule early in 2024. We continue to expand our biobank. If you recall, this is a first-in-class biobank accessible to circulating tumor cells. This is important because it's going to support ongoing development of our pipeline products. Longest lead time in any study is patient enrollment. And our bank gives us a unique ability to test CTCs in future biomarker studies. Investors should also be looking out for updates around our New York State CLIP permit later this year, as well as a publication for our pilot study results as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to David.
Thank you, Paul. So we went IPO in July, raised gross 17 million sterling, net in dollars 21.3, cash balance at the end of December 14.6. So where's the 6.7 gone? So 1.8 million of that was spent on Mount Sinai license. There were two constituent parts to that license. There was a cash payment of 1.8 and then shares to be issued, which was in the end just over 1.7 million shares. Then the EBITDA loss between the time of IPO and end of year was 3.6 million. And then about 1.3 million on working capital, mainly in prepayments and paying off some old creditors. In terms of cash runway, at the time of IPO, we were projecting that forward to early 2024. As Paul mentioned earlier, we're looking at ways to possibly try to extend that further into 2024. On the income statement, a small amount, but notable, being the royalties from our sub-license with SanMed in China. This is, we earned 6% royalties on sales of SanMed of their lung LB test in China. In terms of expenditure, biggest items, payroll cost and work on the clinical trials. In terms of payroll, we are now at full complement in terms of staff numbers. We are at 13 full-time and 2 part-time, albeit one of those part-times is going to move across to full-time. And then EBITDA loss for the year, excluding the IPO costs, 5.8 million. In terms of balance sheet, notable items being the intangible asset being the license to Mount Sinai. And then there's been some additions to right of use assets based on the fact that we extended the lease to our property in Thousand Oaks, California, and spent some more on microscopes. So just taking that and looking at the statements themselves. So the cash flow statements, I've covered that. The only thing I would note here, the other couple of points I'd note here, the convertible notes, those were notes that were raised pre-IPO, which were then converted into shares. And then on the payment of leases, that's the lease payments for the microscope and the property. In terms of the income statement, so gross margin from the royalty sales and then the other sales that we've made are the sale of fish probes into China, 99,000. The exceptional costs, so that's where we split the cost of the share issue between a portion going to the income statement, 1.1 million, and another portion, 1 million, going directly to reserves. The other operating income, akin to a furlough scheme loan from a UK perspective, we received similar funding from the US government that was all fully forgiven in the year, so that's what that relates to. And then on the finance expense, the vast majority of that, 309,000, related to interest on the convertible notes, none of which was paid, all of which was rolled into the principal and then converted into shares. And then balance sheet, tangible asset increase for right of use assets. 5.8 is the license on Mount Sinai. That's not being amortized yet as it's not being used. Trade and receivables, principally prepayments, and lease liabilities being for the microscopes and leased premises. Thank you, Paul. Back to you.
Thanks, David. So that concludes the main part of our presentation. Thank you very much again for your time. David and I are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Paul, David, thank you very much indeed for your presentation this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions using the Q&A tab that's just situated in the right-hand corner of your screen. But just while Paul and David take a few moments to review those questions submitted already, I would like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Paul, David, as you can see, we've received a number of questions throughout today's presentation, and thank you to all investors for submitting their questions. If I could please ask you just to open up that Q&A tab, and where it's appropriate to do so, read out the questions and give your response, and then I'll pick up from you at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So just a few questions here. Who are your main clinical partners? So in the study, we have a few sites activated. That's Mount Sinai, MD Anderson, as well as the Bay Pines VA. And then we have partners that are at other sites that are in different processes in the pipeline to become activated. So we have partners at University of Miami, UC Los Angeles, who are both involved in the study, as well as the scientific advisory board. So they help advise the company on, best path to take in terms of the technology and market. Thank you for that question. What is the go-to market business model, and what margins should look for? So the way that we're going to be commercializing this test is by targeting pulmonologists. Those are the key decision makers for nodule management. And the way that we're going to approach it is not your prototypical sales force. It ends up salespeople will have a somewhat challenging time to get into pulmonary and critical care medicine suites just for patient safety. But what we do understand is that these physicians get a lot of their information through influence style marketing. This is things like peer-reviewed publications. So the pilot study, the validation study. They also tend to attend a lot of conferences. American College of Chest Physicians, IESLC. They understand that they don't typically have access to these leading edge technologies through their typical sales force. So they tend to be much more receptive towards hitting that conference circuit in peer-reviewed publications. We also plan on approaching this as a business development type effort with the chiefs of pulmonary medicine at high volume nodule centers. It's probably no surprise that a lot of our study sites are those high volume nodule centers. That gives those individuals sort of an under the hood or behind the scenes look at how the test performs. And we anticipate that a lot of those sites will be the early adopters for the technology. So thank you very much for that question.
Shall I just cover the margin bit, is the cost of sales at the moment are running around the 280 mark, but that's before us looking for discounts in terms of when you get to volume sales or volume purchases rather.
Thank you, David. What do you see as the biggest challenge to achieving your growth targets? One thing that will be both a challenge and an opportunity is working with the FDA. In my experience when working with them in the past on topics like this, they can be a partner for you, but they do have a lot on their plate with COVID still, even a couple years into the pandemic. Now, the way we mitigate that risk is through our CLIA lab. Again, FDA is voluntary. They're not required for commercialization, but CLIA is, your New York State CLEP permit is. And so the way to mitigate that challenge with regulatory through the FDA is to fall back on your CLIA license. So I'm very pleased that we do have those measures in place. And the last question, have you had initial discussions with any majors who have seen the test, and how do you expect to go to market at scale, post-validation? What timelines are there to sales? So in terms of, I'm assuming this is more strategics. I think once we get on their radar with the peer-reviewed publication, that's going to be something that people are interested in having those conversations with. In terms of when we can start seeing some sales, we believe that's going to be through our clinical utility studies just after the validation study. Clinical utility study is where we'll report on the test results, and then physicians will make decisions on the best clinical care pathway for those patients. That will give us an opportunity to bill for those patients using our code. It's going to be nominal revenues because, again, it's coming from that utility study. We'll be scaling up thereafter.
Paul, I think you've actually managed to address all of the questions that have come through from investors. So thank you very much to you and David for taking the time to address all of those questions. And of course, if there are any further questions submitted, I've just seen one more come in.
Come through.
One more just come through. We can make all the questions available to you at the end of the presentation, but up to you, sir.
Yeah, no, this one's good. So the liquid biopsy sphere appears to be really gaining both in terms of progress and awareness. Which other companies are you keeping an eye on and that you particularly admire in respect of their clinical pathways? You know, one in particular that I do admire, and I think they're making great headway, is Grail. You know, they're trying to make a blood test available that can be in the screening setting for multiple different types of cancer. They're having a bit of a challenge, I think, in lung in particular. It is a tough thing to get early stage using cell-free DNA. But I think something like a blood test for screening is going to democratize access to early cancer detection in general. I think the benefit here is that it's upstream of the lung-LP technology. So even if you do find a cancer, the physician's going to want to follow up with a CT scan. And if there's a nodule that's found in the lung, that's actually a benefit for LUNGLIFE. So I really admire what they're doing. I think they're doing good work up there. So thank you for that question.
That's great, Paul, David. Thank you very much indeed for addressing all those questions. And of course, if there are any further questions submitted today, we will make them available to you immediately after the presentation has ended. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll publish all those responses where it's appropriate to do so on the Investor Meet Company platform, and we'll notify you by email when these are ready for your review. Paul, perhaps before redirecting investors to provide you with their feedback, which I know is particularly important to the company, could I please ask you for a few closing comments just to wrap up with? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. You know, stay healthy, stay safe. We want to thank everybody for their time and interest in taking this journey with us. We really look forward to having a fruitful 2022 and beyond. So thank you.
Paul, David, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to update investors this afternoon. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete, and I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of LUNGLIFE AI Inc., we would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session. So good afternoon to you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.